Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about why we should not abolish the Electoral College. Recently, this issue came up again due to Congressman Steve Cohen. He's the 9th District Representative for the state of Tennessee. And in this year's first congressional session, he introduced a bill to abolish the Electoral College on January 3rd. Now, this is not the first time that this bill or idea has been introduced. However, it's the newest. This discussion has been going on since 1950 at the earliest, and the latest, or the previous bill to abolish the Electoral College was introduced in 2004. Now, I happen to think that this is a big mistake. So throughout the rest of the speech, we're going to be talking about why we should not abolish the Electoral College. First, we're going to talk about what is the Electoral College. We're going to talk about popular vote, if it's good or bad. Next, follow that up with how population demographics can play into it, how the Electoral College can legitimize a presidential win, and how the Electoral College ensures equal representation for all states. So let's start with what is the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a congressional compromise. It's also a process, not a place. But during the founding of our country, the debate was to whether we had Congress choose our president or if we went off the popular vote. Now, this was the Electoral College was the compromise for that. How does the Electoral College work? Well, it consists of 538 votes, requires a majority of 270 votes to win, and each state has a minimum of 3 electoral votes. Now, the rest depending on population. So, why is the popular vote a bad thing? Well, I think it would end up being a popularity contest. See, high population areas would rule the roost, and it could end up being that more rural areas could end up being either neglected or just plain forgotten about. I also think campaigning would be a big issue with this, as in you might have emotional appeal versus logical appeal. Emotional appeal would just be people, presidential candidates appealing to things that make people happy and not focusing on hard decisions, even though they may be controversial. Next, I think a big issue would be smear campaigns, which is already a big issue in my opinion. However, I think that character attacks, if it were a popular vote, would end up being way more of an issue instead of just focusing on policies and how to make our country even better. And lastly, I don't know if you guys saw it, but I remember during the 2016 presidential election, I heard a lot of, if you don't vote for Trump, Hillary will win, and if you don't vote for Hillary, Trump will win. Now, I don't think that that's the best way to rule or to govern a country. I would rather focus on policies and plans versus popularity. So now, if the popular vote doesn't count, why does my vote matter? Well, again, I said each state has at least 3 electoral votes. Now, most states have a winner-take-all mentality with their votes, being if Texas wins the popular vote for the Republicans, all their Electoral College votes go towards the Republican candidate. Now, almost all states have this, so it ends up being more of a 51 popular votes versus just 1 popular vote. So why is the one popular vote such a bad thing? Well, population demographics play a huge role into it. The top 4 states equal 30% of the U.S. population. Now, on my slideshow, I've got a map that shows where the highest population areas are at, and no surprise, the majority of the country is not included in those areas. Now, one of the reasons why population demographics matter is because now, if you take the top 4 states being California, New York, Florida, and Texas, they essentially will control the country. Now, when we start talking about states, equal state representation, I'll talk a little bit about how not all states require the same things. So another part of the Electoral College is that it legitimizes a presidential win. The Electoral College requires a majority. Now, we would probably also require a majority if we had the popular vote, but it becomes significantly more difficult to do. As of now, you require 270 electoral votes to win. One of the issues with popular vote could be runoff votes. Now, that being said, basically a runoff vote is presidential candidates or any voting candidate not required or not reaching a majority. So that plays into the next part of local candidates. So say you have a representative in California, New York, Texas, and Florida, and say they all win, 15% of the vote, or roughly, or one president wins with 20% of the vote. Now you have an elected official for over the entire country who only won 20% of the vote because he's just in a high population area where people know his name and they're already okay with his policies. So that's one potential issue of a popular vote. And lastly, we're going to talk about equality for all states. So first off, we'll go over how states get their electoral votes. So each state is guaranteed 3, 1 for each senator, and 2, or then there are always 2, and 1 for each U.S. representative, which can change depending on their population. So, like I said earlier, the amount of electoral votes is equal to the population of the state. So California, being one of the biggest states, does have more of a say in electoral votes than, say, Wyoming, with roughly 570,000 people. So, but the Electoral College still makes it to where presidential candidates and presidents have to campaign and get the votes for the smaller states like Wyoming. One of the problems with the popular vote is you may end up with forgotten states, like I said earlier, and this ends up with being lower population areas not getting a seat at the table and not being thought about during policies. You could have campaigning bias where presidents only campaign in high population areas, and then you have the same thing with policy bias where they may only create policies that affect higher population areas and forget about the lower population areas. Well, like I said earlier, each state has different needs. So what works for California doesn't necessarily work for Nebraska, and what works for Nebraska isn't going to work for Texas, and Texas and New York don't need the same thing as well. But that's everything for my speech today. So now hopefully you understand what the Electoral College is, if the popular vote is good or bad, how population demographics play into it, how it'll legitimize a presidential win, and how it ensures equal representation for each state. I think it's a key process to the way our country's ran, and I definitely do not agree with abolishing it. Thank you. Have a nice day.